Yeah, that's not an easy question to answer because ultimately the very first spark was photographing weddings was too stressful for me.
What?
Yeah.
I can't think of any more human activity than conducting science experiments.
The game I play is a very interesting one. It's imagination in a tight straitjacket.
The beauty of a living thing is not the atoms that go into it, but the way those atoms are put together.
What I always think should be the basis of education is not answers but questions. We should teach kids how to question.
Welcome to Blabcoats. My name is Amit Siddiqui. So today on the podcast we had Dr. Chris Carginan, who studies how we produce sound and speech using our vocal tract. It was a fascinating conversation because I learned some really cool shit about how our vocal tract works and specifically how singers are able to manipulate those variables to create beautiful sound and music. Also, what I would like you guys to do is to like our Facebook page if you haven't done so already. Give us some feedback on that. And you could also give us some feedback on iTunes and any other podcasting app that you use. I really enjoyed this conversation and I hope you guys do too.
You can get an accurate representation of the entire surface of the tongue, but only in 2 dimensions, right? So that depends on the orientation of this probe that I have underneath my tongue. And currently I have it oriented in the sagittal plane so that you can see the surface of the tongue. Yep, you can see the surface of the tongue from the back, which is on the left. So if I say ka, 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 that's the back of my tongue. And then the front of the tongue on the right. So if I say ta, 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 that's the front of the tongue. But what I'm missing is the fact that the tongue is a 3-dimensional structure. I don't get any of that information here.
Most of our listeners will be audio. Only a handful would probably see the video, but
That's a shame. Everyone should see it. It's fun.
Why?
Because they'll be able to actually see how my tongue moves when I speak, which is the basis of my research. And this isn't an everyday thing, right? You don't get to just see this walking down the street, people's tongues moving. So it's it's quite a fun experience to see it for the first time.
Exactly. So Chris has actually got an ultrasound attached to his throat-ish.
Yeah, so underneath at the bottom part of my tongue. So if you feel with your finger right underneath by your jaw, you feel that muscle and you try to speak. Yeah. See, that is actually the bottom side of your tongue. It's really large. So if you put the ultrasound down there, you can image even the top part of it.
Yeah, so we're recording that as well as the audio and the video in the lab. So if you're just listening to the audio of this, go check it out on YouTube and Facebook and wherever we put our stuff. So cool. Thanks for agreeing to be on the podcast. So I had Chris as a supervisor for a unit in my master's learning and processing human language, and you were working, I think it was articulatory differences in speech and singing.
Yep.
And at that time, I was curious about how the vocal tract works because I have singer friends, and I'm like, how do you guys do that? That's just like, you guys, like, I don't know, like, it's just magical. I have the same, like, I have a vocal tract, you have a vocal tract, but with yours, you can create beautiful music. With mine, I just create nonsense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was very happy to do that project with you. And as I was telling you before, a couple of the programming stuff was actually very useful for my thesis because I used some of the figures, or some of the ways that, I should say, R is one of those programs that's really has great utility when you use it, if you know how to use it.
Yeah.
So
it's free.
And it's free. Yeah, which is really cool. And so Chris actually trained me on that, and it was very awesome. Came in handy for my thesis.
Glad to hear it.
I like to start with the inspiration question. You know, I'm always curious about what was the initial spark that put you on this path?
Yeah. That's not an easy question to answer because ultimately the very first spark was photographing weddings was too stressful for me.
What?
Yeah. So that's actually, I went to college initially for photography. I was in art school, and I still do photography as a hobby, as an amateur photographer. But that first year of art school, I was an apprentice for a local photographer and helping with some of his gigs. And then I tried to do some weddings on my own, which went well. They were fine. But to this day is the most stressful thing I've ever done in my life. And I couldn't handle it. So I ran away screaming.
What's so stressful about taking photos at the wedding?
Because you're taking photos of one of the most important days of two people's lives, right? And if anything goes wrong with those, there's only one person to blame.
That's you.
That's you. And it was just too much. So I threw that down. Didn't touch my camera for like 2 or 3 years because
Really?
it stressed me out. But that is to say that I had taken French in high school, and I was trying to figure out, okay, well, what do I do? I just finished my freshman year of university, and I have no idea what I'm going to do. I want to take French classes again because I enjoyed that. And a friend who ended up being one of my roommates in college, he was in French courses at the time, and I said, oh, can I just sit in, go to class with you and sit in and see how the French is and see if I'll be okay with that. And he said, yeah. And I think one of the courses he had after that in the day was a linguistics course because he was double majoring in French and linguistics. And I was like, what in the world is that? I've never heard of linguistics. What is this? So he told me about linguistics, which is simply put, the scientific study of language. And there are lots of different areas of that. And so I started taking some linguistics courses of my own. There were 2 linguistics courses I took. The first semester I was in that college was Introduction to Linguistics and Introduction to Sociolinguistics. One of the worst professors I've ever had. But the reading material, reading about linguistic study, I wanted more of that, and so I just continued taking more classes.
Right.
And
What fascinated you with linguistics? Because I study. I'm a bilingual. Dari was my mother tongue, and learning English, I learned English, but I was never fascinated as to how the English language was constructed. And then only when I started learning Chinese was when I realized, oh, there's probably some value in actually deciphering how languages are put together.
Yeah.
So what was it for you? Why were you fascinated with linguistics?
I think initially it wasn't even about linguistics and about language per se. It was trying to decipher some mysteries, right? And there are mysteries all over with linguistics that that's what our job is trying to figure out what's going on. And there's so much going on in language because it's one of the things that really makes us stand apart as a species. That's where the draw was for me, is just trying to figure out what's going on in all different aspects. I study phonetics, which is speech production now, but in syntax, so the order that words go together, how words are structured internally in different languages, is just all really fascinating to me.
So you start doing these linguistic classes, and then what happened?
I graduated, and I didn't want to stop, so I continued on in grad school with linguistics, and before I knew it, I had a PhD, and I didn't want to stop, so I continued working, doing linguistics. I love it. I really love my work.
That's fascinating. So when you finished, was it a degree or so once you finished that, you said you went into postgrad?
Yeah.
Was it like an honors or a master's in America?
It's a little bit different in America, and it depends on what university you're in. So the track that I did specifically was, so in undergrad, I double majored, like my friend who I met, in French and linguistics. And so then I went to grad school for French linguistics. It was a specific track in the French department. You could either do literature or linguistics, and this was University of Illinois. And at the University of Illinois, their specific model was it's a PhD track. So you do 6 odd years of work that gets you your master's along the way to finishing the PhD. So it's one long haul.
So it's a master's and a PhD
combined. Yep.
And so what were you researching in your master's?
I was researching what ended up being the same thing that I was researching then later for my PhD, and what I'm still looking at is in French, and I was looking at different dialects of French. There are differences in what we call vowel nasality, and they are what we call contrastive. So whether there's air coming out of your nose or not can completely change the meaning of a word. So there's a difference between like peau, which is skin, and pont, which is bridge, right? So to a French person, they have no idea what they're doing, right? But what's really going on is that for pont, there's air coming out of the nose, but it also affects the acoustic signal in a way that we don't really understand what's going on in the vocal tract other than air coming out of the nose. So what I looked at is studying the vocal tract along with the air coming out of the nose to see what is truly happening inside the head of a French speaker when they're producing these different sounds.
Right. Okay. And why is there? That's a very subtle difference. That must be really difficult. Like for me, like I could barely hear it, but just one felt more nasally.
Yep.
Why is that? Is that important? Did one evolve from the other? Can you tell us a bit?
Yeah.
More about
So there are a lot of different languages that have phonemic vowel nasality, like French or Hindi or Portuguese, and they produce the nasal vowels in different ways. But a common evolution of vowel nasality is from when a nasal consonant is next to a vowel and you pronounce it very quickly in regular speech, the timing of the lowering of the velum, which allows air to come out of the nose, is not always precise because we're not robots. You know, it takes us time to do things, and it can sort of bleed over in a way into the vowel itself. So what you get is an overlap of an oral vowel where there is no nasalization and a nasal consonant like or n where there is nasalization, and then the overlap creates a nasal vowel or vowel nasality on it. And the more that happens, the more speakers of a language throughout generations can start to contribute that to the vowel itself and start to produce it that way. So actually English is undergoing a very similar sound change in a lot of dialects. You get in my dialect, in Pacific Northwest American English, you get a difference between cat, C-A-T, and can't, C-A-N, apostrophe T, but you don't pronounce the N, right? Cat, can't.
So all I hear is cat and can't.
Right?
But are you saying that you guys, those are synonymous in America?
They're not synonymous. They're different words, but where you pronounce a little bit of an N, in my dialect, it has evolved far enough that the N is no longer pronounced, and the only difference between those is cat has, so there are two consonants, the k, and then at the end the t, and in the middle, the vowel a. And in can't, same k and t, but in the middle you have an. That's it. There is no N. There is an oral vowel in cat and a nasal vowel in can't, and that's what makes the difference between the two words.
And so going back to what you were saying before, so it's actually the consonants that change the vowel to become nasal.
Yes.
And then slowly that vowel becomes nasal and people just pronounce it as a nasal vowel.
Yes, yeah. And when you get to the point in the evolution of that sound change where the speaker starts to cognitively contribute the nasalization to the vowel and no longer to the consonant, there's no need for the consonant anymore and it's not pronounced.
Why does it? Why does language evolve that way?
That is a big question. We don't really have an answer to that. What we don't have an answer to is why language evolves, period. Right? It's just something that always happens. So we're at, if you take a snapshot of English right now, you're understanding me, I'm understanding you. Why don't we just stick with that? Right? It works. So why does the system have to change? Hopefully someday we'll have an answer to that. We don't yet. But what we do understand are individual sort of little reasons why certain sound changes may occur. And then the more that we can understand and put together those individual sound changes, we can get a better picture of why, as a cognitive process, do humans change in this way.
Right. To me, as a biochemist and cell biologist, language evolving almost seems like how we as human beings evolve. So you have these small mutations in your DNA, and eventually over time those build up, and next thing you know, over like generations, thousands of generations, you have a complete new species. In this case, it would be a completely new language.
Yep.
In our body, we have a lot of errors. So the human, even in our genome, there's a lot of nonsense in there. There's a lot of repetition. You can see there's all these errors, and that's what supports the idea of evolution. Is it the same thing with languages?
Yes, but we view them less as errors and more as variation. That's actually, it's crucial to our understanding of language. So if we were not able to deal with variability, we wouldn't, for example, as children grow up, they wouldn't be able to understand speakers who are not, for example, their parents, right? So anyone they meet out on the street, if they go to the market, that person does not have the same voice as their mom or their dad. If they can't deal with that kind of variation, they're not going to be able to understand them. So in both the cognitive process and the perception of language, and then also in how we produce language, variation is crucial to that whole cycle. And that variation introduces mutations, as you would call them in your field of study. Right. And if those mutations then start to then be perceived as something significant, then you have sound change.
Right, okay. And those that aren't perceived to be significant are just ignored.
Exactly.
Ah, that's interesting. What I was trying to get to with the previous question also is, one of the reasons why we don't know, we do know there isn't an intelligent design when it comes to species and human beings is because of all these other mutations that aren't, as you said, aren't significant or aren't noticed in our biology. And you can look at the evolution of species and you can see that this isn't the best way of doing it, but through evolution, we've come to this point and it works well enough to survive. When you look at language, is there a similarity in the sense that, do we have man-made languages that are, like, what would be the difference? I'm thinking, I don't know, I have this thought that if there was a man-made language, it'd be much more efficient. You wouldn't have consonants and sounds and phonemes that aren't really necessary for communication because of trial and error that might arise from normal language development. Would that be fair to say?
Not quite sure about that. I mean, we do have man-made languages like
the Thraki in Game of Thrones.
Yeah, and Elvish and Klingon and even Esperanto as not. So the idea behind Esperanto is that it's not a fictional language. It's a language that people have created to actually use to communicate. But these languages don't seem to work in the same way that natural human languages do. And the ways that they do work are often borrowed from real human languages. So we're very good as a species at pattern recognition and taking signals and processing them and sifting out what's important and what's not. And when we apply that to language, we come up with something that internally our cognitive process can do that we can't do explicitly quite yet, not as well. So
Right.
we're just really good at creating systems like that.
Okay. For people who may not be in your field, and I have a lot of friends who are in the hard science. Not to say this isn't hard, because you guys actually quantify tongue movement, but a lot of my friends wouldn't be aware of what you guys are doing. What would be like the utility of studying language?
Well, let's talk about, I guess, maybe the utility of studying speech production, because that's what I do, and
Sure.
that's what I know more about. Well, if you want to take real world examples, even outside of the field of speech production science, where's all right, so my iPhone here, my microphone is currently broken, but if I were to talk to Siri,
Yeah.
and Siri's to understand me and talk back to me in a way that I can understand, none of that is possible without the work that we do.
Oh wow.
So by studying how humans do this and how we do it efficiently and well, we're better able to inform the models for both speech recognition of computers and then speech synthesis and production. So if you look at teams, really large technical teams who work for these sort of goals, like Google or Amazon or whoever, they always have linguists working with them as part of the team, because you need to understand how the humans work in order to then better develop the correct models.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, you have to be able, so you can mimic what they are doing. Okay. So you're looking in our project. When I worked with you, we're looking at the differences between the tongue shape differences between singing and speech. Tell us a little bit about that, because are you still working on the project?
Yeah, so that's an ongoing project that eventually we'll be able to publish something with it, but it's a lot of work because we have a lot of data to sift through. From the preliminary results, what we find is that one constant difference across the singers that we're looking at is the importance of opening up the oral cavity to allow air to flow and resonate. So no matter what the vowel is, so examples of vowels are like E, A, U, A, O. Let's go through them. So E, A, A, O, U. Okay? So the tongue has to be in a very specific place for you to be able to recognize what that vowel is, right? And that's different from, so E versus U, the tongue is in a completely different place. Regardless, singers will still move the position of the tongue in a way that sort of balances being able to have the audience still recognize what that vowel is, but then also provide enough air in the oral cavity for air or enough room in the oral cavity for air to come through and resonate. That seems to be one of the primary goals for these professional singers, is positioning the vocal tract in a way that you can still make smaller changes of the tongue and get distinction between vowels, but then overall the vowels still have a large area for air to move and resonate.
Right. So when we think about the voice and the movement of the tongue and other parts of the vocal tract, what is it altering per se? I mean, you're moving the tongue, but I think Formant frequencies was something that we covered in that unit.
Yeah, so that's also an area that we're still trying to figure out what precisely acoustically is the goal of speech, and what is the goal of production, and what is the goal of perception. Formant frequencies are a good way to distill vowel sounds down into just a number of different variables that we can measure and then describe differences between vowels. They also seem to be important for perception between vowels. So if you synthesize just those formants and you don't have all that extra acoustic information, you can still reasonably get a difference between different vowels. But the real answer is much more complex than that, and we're still trying to dig into, in this very complex acoustic system, what is actually important for perceiving sounds as not only different sounds, difference between E and U, but what, for example, makes a sound sound like robotic, like Siri? Or how do you know that that is Siri and not an actual person on the phone? We're still not there yet, and it's that kind of research where we try to better understand what are we missing in those acoustics that we can better replicate.
Right. So do we know, how much do we know about that so far?
Less than we should. So formant frequencies work very well, but they're based ultimately off of modeling the vocal tract as a straight tube, and that has varying constrictions along it. And that's a model that's now about 50 or 60 years old that I believe we can definitely improve upon to get more accurate results. So, for example, formant changes that we contribute broadly to how high the tongue is in the mouth or how forward it is in the mouth, they differ depending on where the tongue was first at in the mouth. So if the tongue is forward in the mouth, moving it up and down or forward and back doesn't quite have the same result as if the tongue is far back in the mouth, moving it up and back and forth doesn't give the same results.
Oh, that's interesting. Why?
Because the vocal tract is not a straight tube. It's a very complicated system that is, first of all, it's not straight. It's got mucus. It can change its shape as air builds up. It can increase in its volume. It's a very dynamic system that is different from speaker to speaker. So we really need to get a better understanding of what is common across speakers that is still accounted for in that sort of biological system.
Right. Besides the tube model, have they made any sort of mathematical models which resemble the vocal tract more accurately?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And even very small parts of the vocal tract. So a lot of headway has been made in just modeling the vocal folds. Okay? So the vocal folds are in your larynx, and they are folds of flesh, basically, that are held together through cartilage that you can either open them or close them. And that's a very simplistic model of vocal folds. You open them and close them. Well, really, there's a third dimension where it has thickness, and then the vocal folds, as air builds up behind them, they start to separate at the bottom or than the top, and then as soon as there's high enough pressure, then they open, and then they come back together in a reverse order. So the Bernoulli effect in action. And that sort of three-dimensional aspect to just a very small part of the vocal tract, there's been lots of researchers who have worked in trying to account for all of those differences mathematically, and have come up with actually some very accurate models. And that's just a centimeter of the vocal tract.
This reminds me of like chemists and physicists trying to model like just subatomic particles within like 10 nanometer space, and it takes all the computing power they have for like 10 nanoseconds,
Yeah. But to understand the entire system, you have to understand the parts, right?
You have to, yeah.
Yep.
What has been a challenge in your field in characterizing these the differences or the vocal tract? What's the biggest challenge in your opinion?
The biggest challenge, I would say, is finding still the most accurate mapping between what goes on in the vocal tract and what we record in the acoustics. So what we were talking about previously is once you have the acoustic signal, what parts of those are important for perception and describing a vowel. But even before you get there, we still don't have a complete understanding of a unified description of when the vocal tract changes in very specific and minute ways, how does that affect the acoustics? Because that is, well, we'll go back to the example of the nasal vowels. So that's completely different when the vocal tract changes if the velum is open or if the velum is closed and no air is coming out of the nose. And then when the velum is lowered and open, those changes, the effect on the acoustics is not the same. So one, it's a modeling issue, but the bigger problem is still trying to find a way of getting the correct data, because you always have a trade-off between how accurate both spatially and temporally your signal is and what you can measure, and then also what you get from the acoustics. So this system right here, the ultrasound, this works really well for getting good spatial and temporal resolution. And as you can see, it's not, I have nothing in my mouth, so we can get really good acoustics, but we're limited in what we're looking at, right? The tongue is only one part of the vocal tract. It's a very large part of the vocal tract, and it's a very interesting part, but we're not getting all the information. So in order to get that, you have to use different tools, and those tools only look at a different part of the vocal tract. And so then you get decades of research where everyone is trying to use all of these different pieces to try to understand that question. Right. And I think the answer is ultimately going to be an MRI because you get all the information about the vocal tract, but the downside is the acoustics aren't as good.
Right, because it's so loud.
It's very loud, yes.
It's super loud, yeah. That's interesting, yeah. That it's as I'm talking with you, it reminds me of my own project. I have this issue of, if I want to be have high temporal resolution, I miss on the spatial resolution. If I want the spatial resolution, I can't get the temporal resolution, and so I can only get a snapshot of things, and then it's through multiple snapshots with different techniques can you start to build an image of what's happening.
Classical problem of signal processing. Any signal has that problem. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned the ultrasound here. There's another, the EMMA system. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because that's really cool, actually.
Yeah, so what this is good at, you can see in the image there, we get very good temporal resolution in that we can see very quick actions. We get good spatial resolution in the sense of you can get an accurate representation of the entire surface of the tongue, but only in 2 dimensions, right? So that depends on the orientation of this probe that I have underneath my tongue. And currently I have it oriented in the sagittal plane so that you can see the surface of the tongue. Yep, you can see the surface of the tongue from the back, which is on the left. So if I say ka, 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 that's the back of my tongue. And then the front of the tongue on the right. So if I say ta, 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 that's the front of the tongue. But what I'm missing is the fact that the tongue is a 3-dimensional structure. I don't get any of that information here. Now, I could change the probe orientation and get the coronal plane, but then I'm missing everything that's going on in the sagittal plane. Where the EMMA comes in is that, so, I don't know if, you can see it in the background here.
Yeah,
okay, so this system here, if you can see the wires that are hanging down, at the end of those wires are little tiny electromagnetic coils that we use the property of electromagnetic decay to know, so 1 over r squared, we know, based on that, how far away those sensors are from that blue box, which is emitting electromagnetic field of certain strength at certain frequencies. So based on that very basic understanding of physics, we can glue those on the vocal tract and know where they're moving as the tongue moves in 3 dimensions, right? So we get that 3-dimensional aspect, but again, there's the trade-off. You only know where those sensors are. You don't get the entire surface of the tongue. But like in the singing project, you can combine both to get a better representation of what is going on over the entire surface of the tongue in the sagittal plane, and at the same time, what are the sides of the tongue are doing in 3 dimensions.
Yeah, that's important, right? Because it could be up it could be like that or concave, and
It can also the sides of the tongue. So for the example, the sound ol. Okay, so the L sound. What's important there? So you can't see it here. So ol. So if I say la 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 la, that's going to look a lot like ta 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 ta. Except what you don't see is that on the sides of the tongue, they're compressed inward to allow air to flow around for ul, and you don't get that with t. You don't get, you can't see that on the ultrasound, obviously. You would be able to see that and get an indication of that with the EMA system.
that is so cool.
I think so.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating because I'm fascinated by how things work, and the more you learn about your body, the more you realize how amazing it is.
Yeah.
Like I would have never thought about this. You know, how the air comes out, the different shapes that you have to maintain in your mouth to pronounce certain words and vowels. That's mind blowing.
It's a very small part of the body too. Proportionally, you look at the rest of the body and what the rest of the body does. All of speech production is, well, minus the lungs, which provides the power and the air, it's all right here. You know, this small area of the body does everything, right? And so that's what we study, is what that small area of the body does. Like you said at the beginning of the interview, you have a vocal tract, I have a vocal tract, 7 billion people in the world have a vocal tract, and yet out of that shared area, we get over 7,000 recorded languages.
Yeah, that's crazy. Okay, cool. Let's talk about couple of things. So we've spoken a bit about your journey, now your research, which was fascinating. Let's focus towards the future.
Okay.
What do you want to accomplish with yourself? I often ask this to scientists, and I know it's a big question, but different people have different motivations into getting science. I've met people who genuinely feel like they have an obligation to change the world in whatever small sense. And then there are other people who just want to pursue something that they're very interested in, and there's no like this grand plan of changing the world, you know. But I'm curious, what do you want to accomplish with yourself before you leave?
I think, well, both are parts of my end goal, but I think ultimately it's more the latter. I really love what I'm doing, and I just want to continue doing that. But a great, I don't want to say side effect, but along with doing what I love, I also love the fact that we can understand more of who we are as a species. I mean, that's the curiosity of what is human is one of the biggest things that makes us human, is knowing what makes us human, right? And so to be able to contribute to that in understanding, like I mentioned before, if you think about the things that set us apart as a species, this sort of complex communication that we're engaged in right now is one of the hallmarks of human, right? Of Homo sapiens, the fact that we can do this. And to be able to understand that better while at the same time getting to do every day what I love it's great. I mean, I couldn't ask for anything more than that.
Yeah. Where do you see your field going in about 50 years' time?
Computation.
Can you elaborate?
Yep. So anyone who wants to get into the field, or really any field, my advice is learn programming of some sort, research the field, understand what languages people are using, and learn them. Because this is where the field is going, and in a very concrete way, if you look at what jobs are available in the field, that's what they're moving towards. So whereas even just a few years ago, you look at what jobs people are advertising, it used to be more traditionally phonetics, right? Now, if you look at what are basically the same description as phonetics, are not listed as phonetics, they're listed as computational linguistics. Because this is where I think most of the advances are going to be made, is in the fact that we have all of these tools available to us, but we need to utilize them in a way to get more data and understand that data, and that takes better computational models and also more inventive thinking about how to use the technologies and the signals. So that's most of my work is within linguistics. There are all these different areas, and then my area is in phonetics, and even within phonetics, I'm in the sort of engineering part of the phonetics, right? So what I do is basically engineering of the vocal tract. So it's all signal analysis and image analysis to try to get to some goal, and that goal is usually different depending on who I happen to be working with. So singing, for example, with Professor Kathy Best, she's really interested in that because she has professional singing training. But for me, it's the engineering problem, right? One research project that I'm currently working on is trying to understand, so of the two muscles of the jaw that both attach to the same part of the jaw right behind here. So there's the lateral pterygoid, which connects to the condyle, and then there's also the medial pterygoid, which goes vertically and connects to the jaw, trying to understand how those two are related for speech production. So what I have is a lot of data, different signals. We have EMA signals. We have signals of intramuscular activity of wires that were put into those muscles. And I have a goal, right? So my sort of job every time I sit down in front of the computer every day is try to get to that goal with this mess of data, right? And that's horribly fun. I love it.
It seems like you've had the advantage of having these skills, engineering and sound engineering, would you say, or signal engineering? I don't even know what to call it.
But just signal processing.
Signal processing, and like programming and so those are the skills that would enable you to work on not just what you're doing here, but all sorts of projects.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And that must be very useful.
Yeah, even if I wanted to not work in academia anymore and work in technology and industry in some way, those are necessary tools, right? And it's actually becoming, it's coming to the point within academia, it's becoming necessary. You have to have good statistical knowledge, and you really, to be able to get above and beyond the research that's already been done, requires computational know-how. But you don't have to have a background in it. When I was in a French department.
Yeah.
They didn't teach us programming in French, right? They taught us Baudelaire and stuff like that. So I learned it from scratch. I had a professor in the linguistics department who taught me what he knew, and I looked online and I talked with other students who were learning it, and then I got to the point where I could do it. So it's not like, to be able to, if you want to get into linguistics, you don't have to have a degree in computer science. You can learn it along the way and then do the work.
That's so cool. So you're self-taught.
Yeah,
pretty much.
Yeah, because nobody, as you can imagine, it's not a huge field, so it's not like companies are making all of this software to analyze these signals. You have to do it yourself.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, looking into the future, and this could be in whatever context, what scares you the most?
Oof. On a pragmatic level, jobs, finding jobs that are continuing. So we were talking about this earlier before the interview, but so the job that I have here, I love, but it's part of a short-term contract, which is coming up to its close. And so in a couple of months, I'm moving to Munich in Germany. There's the Institute for Phonetics and Speech Processing. It's a research institute that, as the name suggests, is just dedicated to phonetics and speech processing, the work that I do. And I'm really, really happy about that. That's also another short-term contract for 3 years. So eventually, I would like to get to the point where I can continue doing the work that I love and not have to worry about packing up everything and moving somewhere else in the world in another couple of years. So I think that on a pragmatic level, putting food on the table is that.
Yeah, you gotta feed your cat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he eats a lot.
That's funny. Last question, and we're almost reaching almost an hour now, 50 something minutes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, time flies.
Yeah. Hopefully this is still recording okay.
Hopefully. What would be some advice you'd pass on to students coming up?
I would say, well, a couple of things. Following up on what I just said about my biggest fear, don't let that dissuade you from getting into science. If I didn't love what I do, I wouldn't put up with this life of just a couple of years here and there. But I do love what I do, so it makes it worth it, right? The other sort of more practical advice is, I mentioned earlier, learn programming. I have students who struggle with that, and you can see it's actually becoming a hindrance to getting their work out because people want this, right? So we went through, the history of phonetics went through stages where when phonetics really had a great push in the 70s and 80s for qualitative descriptive research on speech production, you could get away with just saying, okay, this is what we see here, and it looks like this, and it looks like that. Can't do that anymore. You need to have really solid statistical evidence, which is good. That should be a proper progression. But really, it's becoming harder to even get away with just good statistical modeling of, one snapshot of an ultrasound frame for this particular word versus another. To advance the field, people want to get understanding of what is the time course of speech and how do we get entire sentences out in all the sounds involved. And to do that, like I mentioned earlier, that's a computational problem. You're not going to be able to get that by just sitting there and manually doing something, tracing an ultrasound frame or something like that for 30 frames per second, in the course of speech. It's not going to happen, right? So, and like I said, there aren't tools to do this, industry-wise. No big companies have made this. So if you want to do that work, you have to create the tools yourself.
Right.
So learn programming. It's a lot of fun. Don't be scared by it. I would tell that to students too. It's a blast.
Yeah.
But it's becoming to the point where it's a necessary tool in the field.
Any particular language in programming?
It really depends on what your field is. MATLAB is very, very big in my field, but R is also incredibly big as well, not only just for the statistical modeling and the visualization, but it's becoming more popular for doing some of the analysis that we traditionally do in MATLAB. Python is also very good across fields of science. That's a good language to start with because the concepts that you learn in Python, you can use those in MATLAB and R. They're all very similar. Julia is also another sort of up-and-coming language that's free and sort of it's meant to be a counterpart to MATLAB that you don't have to pay for. But the ones I use the most are MATLAB and R.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I want to thank you so much for your time, Chris. I had
Thank
a
you for
blast.
doing this. This is great.
We got to go. So Siri,
Oh,
go
yeah.
to blabcoats.com.
Hey Siri.
If your phone's going to blabcoats.com now, thank the linguists.
Hey, exactly right. That's exactly right. Hey Siri, Google blabcoats.com. Hey Siri, send Alex a message. Hey, no, I can't even do that. I messed it up. But yeah, Siri is because of came about because of work that linguists like Chris do.
Yeah, I've always found linguistics really interesting. But it's something that I've never formally studied, but whenever you hear little bits through the grapevine, you talk to linguists and things like that, and it sounds like a fascinating research area.
Dude, it is. Because I did a project with Chris, and this is how I got to know him. And it was a unit that I did for my master's, learning and processing human language, and they had a project available. So the way you do this unit was you work on the project as well as you attend lectures and whatever.
Yeah.
And as soon as I saw the name of the topic was articulatory differences between singing and speech, and I thought, oh, this is cool as shit. Because
you're a wannabe singer.
No, I have friends. I think it would be a cool skill to learn, but I have friends who can sing, and I'm always amazed at them. By them, I should say, because we have like a vocal track and they have a vocal track, and yet they can use their instrument to produce specific sounds, to sing, which is so important. And in that project, it made me realize, I'm like, oh, it's all like manipulation. It's not like people are gifted in terms of they have a good,
some people can do it better naturally than others.
Yeah, and also just the quality of their sound.
Physical thing.
Oh yeah, it's just very much like athletics. It made me realize, I'm like, oh, all this is just muscle memory. They have to have certain shapes to produce certain vowels, and essentially we spoke about this with Chris a little bit. So how they think about the vocal track is like a tube model. If you think like a tube, and we'll actually link some videos on our Facebook to show you some of the, like, they have x-rays, but they also have like these tube models of the vocal track, and they are shaped in a certain way. And if you put it on, like, it's like this little machine that makes this buzzing noise, which represents the vocal cord. But if you connect that, it actually goes, oh, like as soon as you remove it, it's like it models different vowels.
That's cool.
Manipulating how the vocal track should be. So it's really cool. And the model, as it goes, as I understand, is that you have this hollow tube, and then you have different points of constriction. And that different point of constriction can be achieved by the movement of your tongue. So if you say something like ah, the back of your tongue is actually flat and it's down, right?
Yeah.
Versus e, the tongue is up. So what you're doing is you're constricting at different parts of that tube, and you can move that constriction point forward or backwards, and that changes the quality of the sound and even the vowel itself.
Yeah.
So it's really cool. And what Chris and I were doing in that project was to see, okay, how does the tongue move when a singer is pronouncing like an oo for singing versus an oo when they're speaking. And we found that in fact singers have a lower tongue position than in singing versus speech. And again, that was to create more resonance, to create more space in the mouth, so that when the sound is coming out from the vocal cords, it resonates more. It's like what it is, it's a bit like singing. You know how you've seen those operatic singers where they like, oh, and they crack the glass. So what they're trying to do, it's the same thing with your head. So you produce a certain frequency and you manipulate it so that it only resonates certain frequencies. And it's really cool.
Yeah, it's interesting. It reminds me of like playing saxophone. A similar thing. So when you play saxophone, you want to put warm air into the instrument. So you have to, when you're breathing through the instrument, you have to manipulate your breath in a way that you're producing warm air. So that's the difference between like a kind of and a closed kind of blow. You get that warm air out. And it's all to do with throat manipulation. And also there's things like flutter tonguing, and you can produce like harmonics and things underneath the notes. By just manipulating your tongue shape and things like that while you're playing it. And I'm pretty sure like most wind instruments have that type of characteristic as well. So it's not even just singing. Yeah.
You know what the weirdest thing I learned about this is that you could have like one frequency. So you could have like, you can hold a single note, and in fact, that's what your vocal cords do. But by changing the vocal track, it emphasizes, it's like every note, like a C on a keyboard, contains all the other notes within it.
Harmonics,
all the other notes within it. And what your vocal track actually does, it emphasizes certain parts. So when you hear a C, that C is the most prominent in that note, right? But all the other notes exist in it as well. And what your vocal track can do, which is so amazing, is that it can really emphasize certain parts of that note, I suppose, which is cool. So you can have the same frequency, but what you do with your vocal track can completely change the sound of it.
Yeah, it's selecting different harmonics out of that range. Yeah, it's cool. And it also reminds me, like, because my son Finley's started kindergarten this year, and so he's been learning to read and write, and he has sometimes had a bit of trouble at first producing T sounds and sounds for like words like the and things like this. And I only just you start to realize it yourself when you're trying to help him out. You're giving him directions about where to put his tongue in his mouth to produce those sounds. And when he gets that right, he gets the sound right. Yeah, it's amazing.
It's amazing how much actually goes into producing speech, and how much of it is unconscious and we don't even realize
That's
it.
that's what I was just about to bring up next. It was kind of how, and it kind of is a nice segue into what you were saying about French and how some of their sounds are distinguished by whether they're putting air out of their nose or not to produce to produce the sound. But I liked how he said that the French people like it as a definite factor, but they're not even aware of it consciously. They just kind of do the sound. And I thought that was really interesting. It kind of reminded me of, I think, Mandarin, because you speak Mandarin, how they have different pitches. And when you speak Mandarin, are you aiming for a different pitch, or does it just kind of happen like as an accent?
So that's a really good question. So when you learn the words, for example, 做, which is like to do, right? 做 is a different pitch. 昨天 is like yesterday, but 做 is like to do. But when you're learning it, you have to learn those pitches specifically, and then you have to say that word with that certain tonal pitch over and over again until it becomes muscle memory, until you don't have to think about it anymore.
Do you think, I guess it'd be because you're learning it as an outsider, you probably have to think a lot about it. But what about people who just grow up speaking Mandarin as their native language? You'd think maybe I don't know, do they have to think about it to that extent, or does it just become innate?
No, they don't have to. I don't think they have to think about it, just like you don't have to think about the words that are coming out of your mouth.
Yeah.
Because English is a stress language. It's not a tonal language. So everything that you do, you don't have to think about. But someone who's learning English, like in Dari, we don't have the, right? We have sa, and like it's a slight distinction. It's like sa and sa. Like it's two different things, but it's not a th. So I think I've mentioned this before. When I came to Australia, I couldn't hear th because it just wasn't in my language.
Yeah.
Right. And so when I used to say like third instead of third, I used to say turd.
That's unfortunate.
I came in turd. So it was hard. It's the same thing with tonal languages. So if you're brought up in that environment where all you hear is tonal changes, you just embody that and you don't even realize it. I got fortunate in that when I was learning English, I was about 7-8 years old. And because of that, like a lot of it was just unconscious learning, picking up from the environment. And it was much easier than what I'm trying to do with Mandarin, which is I have to consciously do everything step by step until it becomes part of my body, and then I don't have to think about the low order function, like the low order moves, but rather high order moves. So it's like hockey and jiu-jitsu, man. When you reach a certain point, when you reach a certain point, I don't have to think about I have to put my foot there, my leg there, my arms here. I have to distribute my weight here. No, all I want to think about is I need to get to that position. I need to tap him out like this, and my body just finds a way.
When you're trying to learn the move or learn the new thing, that's when
you have to
really
slow it down. Really slow it down and repeat it so many times that it becomes
the same as music and everything.
It's the same. It's the same with anything in life.
I don't think it changes for anything.
That's something the more different things I realized, like recently me and my nephew started archery, and it's so analogous to everything else we do in life. It's all about trying to, again, make those fundamental mechanisms or moves part of you, so
make them become a habit.
Exactly.
You don't have to think about it
anymore.
You don't
have to think about it, and then you can think about other things, and slowly you just do that until you don't have to think about like a big portion of what you do. It's just, I want to hit the target, boom, hit the target.
I think one of the most interesting things to come out of that conversation was when he was talking about the evolution of language. So, and I think you asked him, that was a good question, like, why does language evolve? And it seems strange, like, why would there be a selection pressure? Because you'd think there would have to be some type of selection pressure on it.
So that's a good question. I even after the interview, I was trying to get to what causes language to evolve, and I believe what it was, to a certain degree, he said that it's misperception. So if I pronounce a word to you and you misperceive it, so you hear it differently, and then you pronounce it differently,
so it replicates. So it's almost like a mutation in the language. But then the question begs to be asked: why do all languages evolve towards this type of consonants that he was talking about, where the consonants influence the vowels. Because he said that, didn't he? That most languages, or maybe a lot of languages, evolve along this specific pathway. So then, if it is just a mishearing of a particular word or a particular sound, why do they all follow this similar pathway? Like, is that because of the physiologically, the way our throats and things are set up, or is it something else? And if it is physiological, then why didn't languages evolve that way in the first place?
That is a good
I have no answers for those, those questions. Are just questions that occurred to me when I was listening to it.
You know what it reminds me of when you ask why do mutations happen at the DNA level? We know that UV light causes
not why they
mutations.
happen, but like, why do they happen a particular way?
Exactly. Yeah. So why does an A become whatever? You know what I mean? I think
but that's random, right? In DNA. But
sure.
I think what he was saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's actually not random in language, because they go to this similar pathway where, what was it? The consonants change the sound of the vowel to make it become more nasal.
Yeah.
And then after a point, people start putting that nasal inflection on the vowel itself. And he's saying how American accent's kind of heading that way. French is kind of already there, where they have these different vowel sounds now, one nasal and one not. And it's interesting, if languages do follow this similar pathway, why do they converge? Like, I kind of get why there might be differences and why they might evolve, but why do they converge along this single pathway? That's interesting.
I don't think it's the only pathway that's possible.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the ways.
It might be language dependent too.
Yeah, probably, but it's probably one of the ways that languages evolve. You know, there may be multiple ways of how languages evolve, and this is one way that we're aware of. So that if you have like cant, right? C-A-N-T, not C-U-N-T. C-A-N-T, like you can pronounce the N there, but it's very easy for that N to become nasal. Can't. Like you can make the nasal in slowly.
Can't.
Yes, over iterations, over time, it's easy to see how that N sound can make the.
It lends its nasality to the vowel sound.
So we have to kind of just describe what a vowel and the difference between a vowel and a consonant is when you're pronouncing it. So a vowel is not usually, but open. Like your throat is open and air is coming out, like ah, oo, e, o. A consonant is when that air is constricted in a certain point, like ka, you're restricted at the back, ta, you're restricted at the front, and n is restricted at the front. But you can see that by saying n, there's a possibility of you bringing some nasality to that. So the air, instead of coming through your mouth, could also go through your nose. And you could imagine that over time, like a consonant that's N can slowly become like a nasal consonant, and then that could slowly shift the vowel to become a nasal vowel over time. So it's almost like it's coloring that vowel, and that happening over and over again, like over generations, is what he's trying to study. So he's looking at how English, because French has already gone through this evolution of the N becoming a nasal N, and then the vowel becoming essentially that nasal H. Like French people are very known to do that. I don't know why they're driven towards that. Maybe it's environmental dependent. In fact, if I can share with you a hypothesis or maybe a theory, this may be a legit theory.
Legit theory. Yeah. Anyway, go on.
So languages like the Pacific Islanders in Africa, they're very open. And I don't mean that in any disrespectful way, but it's open mouth. Yeah. It's a lot of air. Whereas like Russian and Serbian, it's like close. I can't even know. It's like closed mouth, right? And so the idea is that when you're in open space, right, there's less chance of you actually giving germs to other people. So you talk freely, you're like this. Whereas when you're inside, when it's cold, you have to close your mouth to stop spreading germs. And so people who would speak, oh, hey, we are inside, like this with a big mouth open inside, you'd spread more germs, and over generations, those people would die because they'd be more prone to getting diseases. So, like,
Interesting hypothesis, yeah.
it may be a legit theory. I want people to actually look it up and
Why don't you look it up?
Man, I'm just here to talk, not to actually do research.
I think we couldn't do this post chat without mentioning the recent Facebook chatbot kind of issues. Where, so if people don't know this, actually, let me just bring the news story up so I don't like fully like stuff this. If people aren't familiar with this story, basically, you know, lots of Facebook pages, Google and things, Facebook, social media pages, they have chatbots, right? So you can go on and chat to these bots, and like they try and convince you that they're a real person and things like that. They can do stuff. Siri is a good example of a chatbot. But anyway, these two Facebook chatbots recently had to be shut down because they were talking to each other. And through talking to each other, they actually developed their own language. And so no extra problems happened. Facebook kind of just shut them down.
Oh.
But it's amazing. And it'd be interesting to see, like, with future developments, if these types of artificial languages, not artificial in the sense of being developed by humans, but being artificial as in developed by machines, how they differ from human or natural produced languages. That'd be really interesting. We should read out the chatbot conversation.
We should. But didn't like Facebook trip out because they didn't know? They're like, oh,
they don't know what it means. I don't think. You should. Let's do the conversation because it's really interesting. I've got it here. So who's going to be? I think the
do you want to be Alice or I'll be I'll be Bob. So there's
all right.
Bob.
So you're Bob and I'll be Alice.
First of all, who came up with these names?
Alice voice.
Oh, hello.
And you better do a Bob voice.
Yeah, mate. G'day, my name's Bob.
That might be overkill on the Bob voice.
All right, mate. How about we go to an Australian Bob over here? All right, mate. Bob's line goes like this. I can't. I everything else.
Balls have zero to me, 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 to...
You, I, everything else.
Balls have a ball to me, to me, to me, to me, to me, to me, to me.
Wait, why is Alice so obsessed with balls?
Yeah. Well, no, she's obsessed with herself, I think.
No, it's balls and her. It's got to do with balls and her. I can, I, everything else.
Balls have a ball to me.
Oh my God.
To me, to me, to me, to me, to me.
I.
Balls have zero to me, 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 to me.
And this is where Bob is offering his balls. You,
now
I,
Bob gets
everything else.
Now Bob gets in on the action. You got to read it properly.
Yeah, you, I, everything else.
No, you're not. It's you, I, everything else. That's a language, right? Yeah. They're repeating it. Balls have naught to me, to me, to me, to me, to me.
There's like to me too. And then Bob says...
This goes on until Mark Zuckerberg goes cancel, basically.
You, I, everything else. Balls have zero.
It's a very
to
machine-like...
me.
What I like about this, it's a very machine-like language, isn't it? Like it seems to be working on a number of repetitions of certain words and sounds like that as well. So there's a deeper communication here. It's like those sentences mean nothing in English.
Yeah.
But
it might mean something.
But the number of repetitions, so it's working on the number of repetitions and where things sit in the sentences. Yeah. So they're developing their own languages. Very, very interesting.
What if they're planning to take over the world? This is how like Terminator begins. It's with Skynet is Google and Facebook put together, and these assholes
started through a love of balls.
Exactly. And Alice. Everything to do with balls and her. That's so messed up, dude. Yeah. But that's scary because what if they get to a point like they say, oh, okay, we'll just go for round 2 trials, and then these guys just plan the doom and the downfall of civilization, and next minute these guys have like the robots or this program has access to the internet and just takes over, and then we do have Skynet, and then you have like nuclear bombs coming at each other, like people like Russia and America fighting. Oh, dude, this is the end. We should kill all politicians and
don't let them. Great story.
Let's not do that. Let's not do that.
It also brings up and this is actually something that I think something you guys touched on really briefly, but it also brings up like that, like what it means to be human. You know, what separates humans from the animals, and obviously language is one of those things. But then if we make machines that have their own language, is that line getting instantly more blurry then between man and machine?
Dude, that's scary. That's scary.
You know what I'm saying? Like, let's list off the things that humans have over that separates us from the other animals, yeah?
Yeah.
We've got like language, we've got the ability to do science and reason, yeah? But computers can kind of do a few of these things already.
Yeah.
Yeah. Reasoning is, programmed into computers. They can work out logic and things like this. And now developing languages as well.
Soon enough,
Yeah.
we'll create artificial intelligence. It's just like us, but speaks in repetitions.
Yeah.
Hamid, do you want balls to me, to me, to me, to me, to me, on my face, to you, to you, to you, to you? I don't know, man. What are you on about?
Yeah. It's interesting.
There was one more other thing I was going to talk about. I forget. Artificial and naturally evolved languages.
Yeah, the differences between them. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
So
So I should have probably asked Chris a question like this. So me being the big Game of Thrones fans that I am, by the way, if you haven't watched the leak episode, #losing out.
that would include me, I guess. Then,
Let's not even talk about Alex. Is like, you haven't watched a single episode of Game of Thrones.
I
which
feel
is
like I'm already fallen off the bandwagon. Like,
Dude,
I'm like,
you've
I fell off
missed
the
out.
bandwagon 6 years ago.
Dude.
So there's no point even running to try and catch up now.
Oh, dude, now is the best time because you have almost 7 seasons.
Maybe I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal. How about after I finish my thesis in like 5 weeks' time, I'll start a Game of Thrones marathon and try and catch up to that bandwagon.
Oh, dude, it'll be so good. We won't stop talking about Game of Thrones. That'd be the only thing we'd talk about because there's so much cool shit that happens in that. But anyway, they have like Valyrian as a language. They have Dothraki as a language. And I guess what I wanted to get to, and I watched this in some video or some documentary, is that in naturally evolved languages like English and many other languages, there's a lot of redundancies syntactically, meaning how the words are put together. But there's also a lot of redundancies in the language because it's made through trial and error. So like, it just doesn't make sense. Like, look at English, like all silent letters, it's just nonsense, dude. There's a lot of stuff there that just makes it so much. There's rules and there's so many exceptions to that rules and so many exceptions to that exception. It just makes it so much more difficult. Whereas I believe something like Dothraki or Valyrian or Klingon, whatever that is. And by the way, Chris is a big Star Wars and Star Trek fan, I believe. But languages like that have less redundancies. They're more efficient because they're designed.
The funny thing is, though, that they, I think Chris, they borrow from other languages. And that's like, he mentioned Esperanto as well, which is a constructed language is actually used. It just borrows from other languages and takes bits and probably get rid of a lot of those redundancies and stuff. Yeah, it's interesting how that happens. My mum actually, and when she was, I think, really early teaching, developed a language with one of her colleagues where they would just put the sound ob before every single vowel.
Really?
Yeah.
So
if you want to say the word from has one vowel in it, it'd be frobe-om. Frobom.
Throw-bomb.
Yeah.
Throw that bomb.
But it's the same type of thing, isn't it? That's just a constructed language, but it's already taking that scaffold of English and just kind of adding a different element to it to make it sound different.
Yeah.
But it's actually kind of the same language.
Yeah. And this is what I was trying to make a connection to, was to normal evolution. In that, in normal evolution, we see a lot of redundancies, a lot of things that aren't like they're not the best way to do something, but because it just works and it's good enough, it sticks around.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think the evolution of, I think it was like some sort of vein they were looking at in giraffes, like from the heart to the brain or something.
Oh, yeah,
you know
it's you've forgotten on to me. It's a nerve that goes from, I think it might be the breathing nerve, where it goes down, and then it has to go from like the back of the throat or something to like around behind the nose. So it has to travel this really
like
short distance.
Yeah.
Right? But the way it does that, it comes from fish. The way it did that in fish is it went and looped down behind something. So when it developed into mammals and all the other animals,
Like
that loop was
giraffes.
still there. So
Yeah.
the only way it couldn't like cross past, the only way it could evolve is to get longer and longer and longer and
Just-
longer.
Yeah, slowly over iterations. It was like easier for that loop to get elongated at each step than to redesign the whole thing
Yeah.
and to make it more efficient. And so
The laryngeal nerve.
laryngeal nerve.
Yeah.
So it's like so it seems so inefficient and redundant, but nonetheless it just shows that as long as it works, it's good enough.
Yeah.
You know, and language is a bit like that as well. As long as it works, don't worry if you have all these silly exceptions, all these unpronounceable, like Jack Braithwaite, him and I were talking about language and how this guy was spelling like words based on like how we pronounce certain vowels. So he wrote a word with the O, but the O is supposed to be pronounced as an E or an I, because woman, there's an O in there, or something like that. It was just like you could find each vowel or consonant being pronounced completely different in a different context, and that's stupid.
Yeah.
You know, it's the dumbest thing ever.
Yeah.
Like, why is that?
Yeah.
It shows that its language has evolved over time naturally. That if there was a intelligent designer behind this, it would be perfect. We wouldn't have these redundancies.
Yeah, exactly.
That's,
Yeah, I don't
should
know.
we call it a
I
day?
think we should call it a day.
Yeah, that was an interesting conversation with Chris. And
Yeah, it's fascinating. Linguistics is really interesting. I
cool
like
shit.
it.
Next week,
You always do this. You always introduce the guest next week, and
get
then
them wrong.
and then we change it like halfway through. Don't lie to the listeners.
next week, listen.
Don't lie to them.
Next week, no, that's what I'm gonna say.
He's
next
going to tell you who's on next week. Don't trust him. We don't know who's on next
dude,
week.
you should. No, I was gonna say next week we have someone.
We have someone.
Who we don't know
We'll
who-
definitely have an episode for you next week. That's a guarantee.
We have I think a few good.
We have lots on the shelf.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
but we just have to kind of decide, and we always decide
we
like
have so
around-
many good people. We kind of who will be good next. Yeah. So
Yeah. Just tune in and you'll find out who's on there.
like our Facebook.
Yeah, Twitter, Facebook.
Review us
Instagram.
on your favorite app.
Yeah, I don't know.
Check out our videos. We're recording this stuff now, so you can go on our YouTube account. You can watch us. You can watch us talking, and this is really important for this episode. If you've got to the end of this episode and you haven't gone and watched the video yet, shame on you.
Hey, bro.
Honestly.
No, don't shame people, man. That's viewing shaming. Don't
But
do
go
that.
and do it now. Re-watch it. Check it out. It's really interesting. The stuff with Chris. Yeah.
And that's it. Okay. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you next week. Thanks for listening to Blab Codes. Rate and review our podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast, because it does help us spread the word. And if you like what we're doing here, then help us grow it by sharing this with a friend of a friend, or your mailman, even your mailman's mailman. We also want to hear from you, so send us questions or comments to blabcodes@gmail.com. And if you have any interesting questions or comments, then we'll talk about it on air.